I'm in Liddesdale in the Scottish borders, one of the most deserted and peaceful parts of Britain. Well, it's peaceful now, but in the 15th and 16th century, it was the most lawless place in the whole country. This valley was ruled by gangs of murderers and arsonists and cattle rustlers. They even introduced the word blackmail into the English language, and the people who tried to control them were forced to live in houses like this. 400 years on, there are still families around here who think that they're related to the villains who used to dominate this landscape. Are they right? They've got just 2 days to find out.
Castle, and it was the castle of the keepers of Liddesdale.
Why is it in the middle of nowhere?
It isn't in the middle of nowhere, or it depends on your definition of nowhere anyway. It was a very much more populous area, and it was a very important area. It's a border zone, both for Scotland and England, and the keepers held it. They looked after the laws of the land and ensured that they were maintained, but also they protected the border of the country, and that was the important aspect to the crown, be it the Scottish crown or, of course, the English crown.
Oh, Mick, look at this.
Oh, yeah. But it's very gaunt and dark, isn't it?
Well, it might be now, but you're looking at a ruin now. I mean, before it really was plastered, you've got to imagine the colour and the grandeur as well.
So who were these wild folk who were giving the people who lived here so much trouble?
Oh, well, we're looking really at the farming families of the area, the people of Liddesdale, but not just Liddesdale, of course, all the way along the border, but on both sides of it. It's a whole culture, an economy, if you like, of moving movable assets, be they sheep or be they cattle.
Moving them across the border?
Not just across the border, but also between the families that are feuding on this side of the border, and indeed on the far side.
So it's Scottish families and English families?
Oh, indeed.
And were these poor people?
No, it seems to have been from the very bottom to the top of society.
The raiding largely died out after the union of the English and Scottish crowns in 1603, but the stories and the Reaver family names live on. If your surname's among this lot, you're probably descended from a border cattle rustler. The exploits of the Reavers were recorded 200 years ago by the novelist Sir Walter Scott, who also wrote Rob Roy and Ivanhoe. This is The Minstrelsy, his book of border ballads or folk songs about the Reavers, and it's the starting point for our local history hunters who are going to try and uncover the true story behind 3 of the ballads. They're also hoping to find out whether they're directly descended from the Reavers.
Away, away, thou traitor strong.
One of the few local people who still sings the border ballads is Willie Beattie.
If I had lived but 7 more years, I would hae gilt thee round about.
They're all about very brutal men.
Well, might was right, and they had to live plundering and stealing for to eat, I suppose.
And are all the tunes as gentle as that one?
On the whole, yes, they are. They've woven a more gentle story into the ballad, I should say.
What's your favourite one?
Johnny Armstrong.
Can you do a bit of that?
Yes. Some speak as all lords, some speak as all lairds, and sick like men, o high degree of a gentleman. I sing a song, sometime called Laird of Gilnockie.
A few miles south of Hermitage Castle is Newcastleton, and Mick's come here to meet our first team of history hunters. At the time of the Reivers, this area was dominated by two notorious clans, Armstrong and Elliot.
My mother has always told me that I'm a direct descendant, specifically the 16th direct descendant of Johnny Armstrong of Gilnockie Tower.
And who was Johnny Armstrong?
Johnny Armstrong was a reiver, and
Right.
I think it was about the early 1500s, and he was invited to go to Nearhoik to meet the king when the king of the time, James V, was trying to calm the borders down and calm the clans down. And when he went in his posh gear, his velvets and his jewels, the king was ever so jealous because he hadn't anything like his smart clothes and hung him on the spot with all his followers. Yeah. So it'd be interesting to see if the ballad proves to be correct, and that's what actually did happen.
So you're all going to be working on this together over the next few days?
Yes.
The Elliots and Armstrongs did convene, they were a gallant company, we'll go on and meet our royal king and bring him safe to Gilnockie.
In July 1530, the ballad says that King James V of Scotland arrived in the borders to try and restore peace. Johnny Armstrong was summoned from his estate at Gilnockie to meet the king. At our history room in Newcastleton, the Johnny Armstrong team are comparing the ballad's version of events with other accounts. You looked at the ballad and you found two place names, the place where Johnny Armstrong lived and where he died. Gilnockie is where he lived. Do we know if that's historical fact?
Well, we're not sure because there's the two towers, there's the hollows on Gilnockie, and he lived at one of the two, so that's what we were trying to find out.
What about where he died?
Got more certainty on where he died. We have this book here, History of the Armstrongs, and it's got it on here that the king came up, like it says in the ballad, and summoned them to the place called Carlin Rig, where they were all committed to the gallows. So that's like a fairly certain reference.
So how do we pursue that?
Well, we've found a book, it's at Carlin Rig Cemetery, and we've found that there's 3 graveyards up there. But this stone's Victorian, which is not old enough, so we've had to pursue further around the area, and we've traced where he'd actually been buried.
Is that near here?
That's very well, it's about 30 miles away.
John murdered was at Carlin Rig.
The ballad claims the Armstrongs went to Carlin Rig to swear allegiance to their monarch. Instead, Johnny and 30 of his followers were treacherously hanged.
Brave men be.
You know, you've been looking at the ballad, reading
Stuart and Isabel have come here with the Armstrong clan historian, Alan Armstrong, and archaeologist Tam Ward. They're looking for Johnny's grave.
Yeah.
Well, oh, there it is.
That's, oh, yeah.
Tradition records that near this spot they're buried. Near this spot.
You've looked at this stone. Now, I believe that it was somewhere else that Johnny was buried. Not in this kirkyard, but elsewhere.
Alan Armstrong thinks the grave lies in an earlier burial ground in a field just next to the present churchyard.
You're standing now on top of Johnny and his men.
The team aren't quite so sure.
So the only way we're going to find out is we get a spade out and dig a hole.
That's a fact.
See what we've got down there. Yeah.
Speaking as a field archaeologist, Alan, there's very little to go on this site now. But tradition is very important, obviously. But we would need to do some other types of work to establish if there really is a site here.
Absolutely agree with you. I'd love to get a spade in here, but in fact, what have we got? Consecrated ground. We don't want to start disturbing bodies, we'll be in trouble.
That's right.
The ballad suggests that Johnny was hanged because King James V was jealous of his wealth and power, but other documents give a rather different reason. Stewart and historian Kay McAlpine have found a royal charter granting Armstrong's property to another family shortly after his execution.
And it's actually a letter made to Robert Lord Maxwell and all his heirs, and it says that it's giving the gift of all goods which pertained to the umwhile John Armstrong. The use of the word umwhile tells us that he's definitely dead.
So Johnny was hanged, but for his crimes, not his fine clothes, as the ballad would have us believe.
And it's for theft.
In the 16th century, this was called the debatable land, because neither the kings of England nor Scotland could control it. The Armstrongs had dozens of fortified houses all over Liddesdale. They could muster a private army of over 3,000 men on horseback. In one raid in 1587, 400 riders took over 1,000 cattle and sheep in just one night.
Can you find Gilnockie anywhere on there?
No, I've got the Hollis, that's no problem. It's there. And there's the river, so it should be in the...
Sandra and Martin are trying to work out which Armstrongs lived where. In particular, they're looking for Johnny's house at Gilnockie.
Where's Carnaby?
It's all got funny spellings.
Trace it up the way. Must be up here. Here we go, Carnaby.
Is it on there?
No. Again, there's the Hollis. And there's the river.
But no reference to Gilnockie?
None. So it's like one and the same. Gilnockie Tower, Hollis Tower's the same tower. Different names.
Looks like it, doesn't it?
As I was walking all alone.
According to Alan Armstrong, this is where Johnny of Gilnockie lived. But our team has a different view. They reckon it was on the site of this tower just across the river.
Oh, look at that, it's fantastic.
There you are. There's Hollis. Wonderful sight, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this morning, Alan, when we were looking at this, we came to the conclusion that there was only one tower.
Yes.
We came to that conclusion because there's no mention of Gilnockie in the primary sources.
Yes.
That were written immediately after Johnny Armstrong died.
That's correct.
And we were very interested in the fact that one of the primary sources had Gilnockie in inverted commas, as if it wasn't really a place.
This river here that you've just seen, that is the edge of the debatable land. No man was allowed to build within the debatable lands. No man was allowed to keep his cattle there overnight. They had to be taken off at sunset and brought back at dawn. So basically, there could not have been any real buildings of any strength lying over the other side.
So what date is it then?
1585.
And we're sure of that, are we?
Absolutely sure.
And yet Pont's map of 1582 has it on. Could it be that there was something else on the site and he built something else?
There could have been a timber basel on the site.
Ah, well, I mean, that's where I was going to come in, because it doesn't sound to me as if we're going to resolve this, really.
I don't think it is. Yes.
I mean, we're using evidence that is perhaps debatable in some cases. What is interesting to me as a sort of landscape archaeologist coming in is what an incredible site this is, with the river bending right round this promontory in front of us. So you've got a very, very defensible site, whatever date we're talking about.
Originally, it probably looked like this. Whoever lived here must have been a force to be reckoned with, whether or not he was Johnny Armstrong.
Farewell, thou bonny Gilnock Hall, where on Ask side thou standest stout. If I had lived but 7 more years, I would hae gilt thee round about.
In the 16th century, the Armstrongs were a mafia, the Corleones of the borders. But in 1603, James VI of Scotland also became King of England and set about pacifying the borders. He banished or executed many of the ringleaders, and there are few Armstrongs living here now.
So why have you brought us here, Sandra?
Well, behind us here we have Eccleston churchyard, where a lot of Elliots are buried, both Isabel's relations and mine. If you look across the valley, we can see Mangerton and what's left of the tower, where Johnny Armstrong was probably born. We know he moved down to Canonby, and we know his father was here, and his brother Thomas was at Mangerton at the time the ballad was, at the time of the story of Johnny Armstrong.
Sandra wasn't able to trace her family all the way back to Johnny Armstrong in 1530, but the team did prove that the people in the ballad lived here, nearly 500 years ago. In part 2, our second team of ballad hunters take to the hills in search of the Reivers' smuggling routes, and I visit a fortified house that was lived in by a cattle rustler 400 years ago. Join us after the break. The river which runs through Liddesdale still marks the border between England and Scotland. On the English side is Bewcastle. And in the churchyard, the names on the gravestones remind us how many of the reaving families once lived here.
Look at all these headstones here. Armstrong, Nixon, Routley.
And are you related to any of the Reaver families?
Oh yes, we are all descended from the Armstrongs and the Telfords.
Yeah, and then the stories, they were a reaving family, some of the West Reivers in Bewcastle, according to the records.
Our Bewcastle team want to trace one of the old Reivers' smuggling routes, which is said to run across an area called the Wastes of Bewcastle. It's described in the Ballad of Hobby Noble.
Well, Hobby Noble was a very famous reaver. I think he murdered somebody and he stole somebody's sheep, so he had to go into Liddesdale to escape the law.
Now Hobby was an Englishman and born into Bewcastle Dale, but his misdeeds they were so great, they banished him to Liddesdale.
He led a reprisal raid back into England, but was caught near his shieling or shepherd's hut at a place called Foul Bog Shields. The ballad says he was taken to Carlisle Castle and hanged. So the team have come here to the county record office to see if they can identify the route of Hobby's fateful last raid.
Barbara,
Yes.
I brought these for you to have a look at. They're the calendar of the Border Papers. Let's have a look in the index at the back and see if we can track down Hobby Noble.
That's it.
The calendar of Border Papers is a collection of correspondence from the late 16th century between border officials and the court of Queen Elizabeth I. It includes intelligence reports from local spies. They describe the raids and list the troublemakers.
Oh, here's Noble. Oh,
Right.
what a lot of Nobles. Here's Hobby,
Yeah.
page 124.
That's a good start, that he's actually in the index, though.
Well,
isn't it?
yes. He must have existed if he's in the
Oh, he
index.
must have done.
At Kershope the tryst was set.
The ballad says the raiding party set out from a place called Kershopefoot. The next task for Mick and the team is to trace the route using place names mentioned in the ballad and other documents.
So where did they start and where did they finish then?
Well, they started at the returning home at Kershopefoot and they finished at Foul Bog Shield, which is there.
That's on the Scottish border now, on the
Yes,
river.
yeah.
And this is...
Foul Bog
What's that?
Shield.
Foul... Oh, yeah. God, that's a long way, isn't it? That's
Yes.
10 or 12 miles by the crow flies.
Oh, there's a reference in here from Musgrave's report. It gives the route that some of the reavers took from Liddesdale to the Tyne. It says, when they go to the water of Tyne, they go by Kershope Head.
Yeah.
You know,
Which is where we're at.
Yeah, Kershope
Right.
Head.
Get another pen.
Kershope
Bronco.
Head's there, look.
What colour do you want?
Well, anything that we have now.
Yes, Kershope Head.
Yeah, Kershope.
And without the Geel Crag.
I think that Gale Crag is on one of these old maps. Here's Gale Crag, look. And it's between Christenbury Crags and the Horse Head.
We know where Christenbury Crag is, don't we?
Christenbury Crag.
Christenbury Crag
Right,
there,
mark that up then.
By Tarnbeck and Bogles Gar. So, along by the Spy Crag, and then the Lampert.
That was a regular route, reaving route into Tynedale. Well, we would start at Kershopefoot there, and we would go up the Scottish side of the Kershope Burn, cross over somewhere about Kershope Head, follow along the highest ground, cross the wastes of Bewcastle, cross behind Christenbury, and we would finish off at Foul Bog Shield.
And then he would stop at Foul Bog Shield because that was their own territory.
Right.
And he decided, it says in the ballad that until they came to Foulbog Shield, and their brave noble he lighted down. So they'd really gone far enough, they thought they should have a rest.
Yeah. I think it's marvellous, this, that we've managed to piece in some pieces out of the calendar papers with a map and with the ballad.
Yeah.
Getting a route out of the whole of it.
No, we need to go out and have a look on the ground from here, don't we? In the daylight, though, rather than the night, I think.
Mick and Joan are off in search of Hobby Noble's route. They're also hoping to find his shieling or shepherd's hut, where he was taken prisoner by the English. While they're heading for the border at Curzop Foot, the rest of the team set off to trace the route on the ground.
Now here we are at Curzop Foot, you see.
Ah, yes, yeah. So you've got to imagine him going at night, riding all across here.
Yeah.
Our problem, of course, is going to be finding where he crossed over.
Yes.
Because it's now very wooded.
Yeah.
But it was either, as you said, at Kershope's Head, or perhaps a little bit further up, stuck on the side.
That's Scotch Curzop down in there, the little cottage
right.
there.
Yeah, yeah.
And on this side we'd have English Curzop.
Oh, yes, underneath us now I can see the building, yeah. So that's just demonstrating that it's actually the border.
Yes. Now, we should see a footbridge.
There it is now, look, it's right underneath us now.
That's it.
Right.
And I reckon he would cross over there and head for Marvin's Pike.
Back on the ground, the rest of the team are also trying to find Foul Bog Shields.
So he's heading up the slope in front of us. He's actually heading across then,
yes.
Joan, right across the top of this open country.
Yep.
And there's that peak that we can see, that
yeah.
Christianbury Crag.
Christianbury Crags, yeah.
Right.
What do you reckon?
For Duncan, Barbara and Ivor, this is the end of the road. From here on, the only way to Foul Bog Shields is on foot.
Right. Hopefully it would not be that long. Oops.
Yeah, we're all across the Grey Fell Common now.
Right, so he would have come across
yes,
here.
Yes, he would have come across here,
heading for his own shieling in the woods.
Yeah.
God, it's very difficult to see with the trees, isn't it?
And it's not any easier on the ground.
Hey, you two, you got in the wrong direction, good.
Eh?
Duncan says we're going in the wrong direction.
We've got 4 times as far to go.
Oh, right.
I think.
We haven't gone far enough.
I guess.
Oh yes, it could be over there, couldn't it? Oh yeah. Well, that's that's it. They've left an open space in the wood.
Yeah, and that's where he thought he was home and dry.
And that's where he thought he was safe.
Yeah.
And that's where they took him. And this is the Foul Pits.
Foul Bog Shield.
Foul Bog Shield, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's very emotive, isn't it?
Yeah.
God.
O'er hill and hope and Monia down until they came to the Foul Bog Shield, and their brave noble he lighted down.
Here's the sight, Duncan. It isn't such bad ground, this, is it?
No.
4 hours after Mick and Joan, the rest of the team also find Hobby Noble's shieling.
Yeah. I see it's hard on the inside.
We can actually say that we've been in the steps of Hobby Noble. Yeah.
Aye, aye.
So the shieling was here, and the route in the ballad does exist. Tomorrow's challenge is to find his farm back at Bewcastle.
I'm pleased we found it though, so that's grand.
This isn't Hobby Noble's farm, but it would have looked very similar. It's called a Bastel house, from the French word Bastille. It's just like a tiny little castle.
That's exactly what it is. And hardly any windows. A slit window here, which would give limited light and ventilation into the byre part below, and a very small window, which would have lighted the house part above. And even that has had 2 iron bars on it to protect it against attack.
And the whole thing's built on its own little hill.
That's right. Very strategically positioned for defensive purposes.
The ground floor was where the livestock was kept, protected from raids by thick walls and tiny windows.
Which would give limited ventilation and light for the animals in the byre.
So was this the door?
This is the original door.
It looks like a fireplace, doesn't it?
That's right. It's because the floor's somewhat higher than it should be. It's been blocked up. Here's the original lintel, but the important element is these tunnels for the drawbars.
What? You mean this would have been the only way in? If someone was coming in, you'd put these bars across, but then the person inside would be trapped?
That's right. In most cases he would be stuck, but in this case, at this Barstow house, there was an escape hatch in the roof. Now, these stone stairs are much later to the Barstow, Tony. They were built in the 17th century when times became much more peaceable.
Would there have been stairs here at all?
No, none whatsoever. To get access to the house, you would have had a wooden ladder which you would have pulled up behind you.
It's an amazing view, isn't it?
That's right. You would see trouble coming for miles from this point. So here we have the hole leading from the basement down below into the house part above, which we're now standing in. And at this end we've got the fireplace, which may not actually be original, but certainly the stone floor gives a very good impression of what the house might have been like.
The Hobby Noble team are back at the records office in Carlisle. They're trying to prove that Hobby had a Bastel house in Bewcastle Dale.
And there's two place names mentioned, Crewe and Parkhead, and Joan has found in the place names of Bewcastle a field called Hobby's Close.
Hobby's Close, at Parkhead.
At Parkhead.
There's one nagging thing in my head, though, is that it seems to me that you're looking very much at the general, at the big picture, the idea that you might be able to get a link through fields and place names. Is it worth seeing if you can find documents which would relate more to him as a person?
You could actually try and establish if he left a will.
Oh, well, that would be an idea.
Because that is a direct link to the man.
Yep.
Well, it would, if he had anything to leave. He hasn't been so wealthy, has he?
David?
Go ahead.
Now, you want after 1600, not before?
Yeah.
Right, well, that's the index that you need to look in.
Mm-hmm.
What is it we're looking for, then?
Have you got any noble wills for
Well, we'll need to look. What you'll need to look, Barbara, is literally under the letter N, because they're arranged in year of probate, but not in strict alphabetical order. So it's a slightly longer search.
Oh.
If we turn to here, the H.
No,
right. See, this is where the N's start. Thomas Noble there, for example.
Oh.
But
there's a William. There was a William there I saw somewhere.
Yeah, we
need a Robert.
Is that a Robert? Is that a Robert Noble?
Oh, there's a Robert Noble.
Robert Noble.
Parkside. Ah, no, that
That's
might have been
near.
near Parkhead. There might have been a cottage on Parkhead called.
1620.
Quite likely.
Yeah. Try that one.
Yeah.
Try that one. Have you got that one?
Yeah.
Is that here?
That's here, in the strong rooms upstairs.
Can we get to it?
You certainly can.
Right, come on, gang, off we go. The will dates from 1620, and we know from other documents that Robert Noble, alias Hobby, was raiding across the border in the 1580s and 90s. The dates appear to fit the same person.
Of course, the strong rooms are locked and bolted, and they're not in use.
400 years after the events of the ballad, we think we've found our man.
Look at this.
Yes.
So, wills for 1620. 1620. Now then. Right. Take the lid.
So 1620?
Yes, 1620. Now you're wanting N for Noble, Barbara. Oh, there it is.
Is that it?
That's it. Robert Noble.
Robert Noble.
Right, there it is.
That's it.
What does it say?
Well, now it's difficult to read.
It's actually letters of administration of Robert Noble, late of Parkhead. It is Parkhead.
Oh, it is
Parochia de Bewcastle, parish of Bewcastle. Turn it over. Yes, 1620. Yes, this is letters of administration, so it's not a will as we would expect. Or even, well, the inventory doesn't unfortunately list his goods, just values them at £3, 6 shillings and 8p.
Why did it say Parkside downstairs?
I can only imagine that when that index was done, Tony, sometime in the late 19th century, someone has just had difficulty with the handwriting.
Oh.
So we've got...
So we've maybe got a Parkhead after all.
Oh, it's definitely Parkhead.
Oh, yes.
How about that?
Oh, that's great.
The existence of the will makes it much more likely that Hobby Noble didn't die on the gallows, as the ballad suggests, but at his farm at Parkhead in Bewcastle.
Come here, Tony, look at
The
this.
team have found what they think are the remains of a bastle house.
See the obvious square.
Wait a minute,
You can actually follow it by seeing the stones in the bank sticking out of the ground there. So the building is defined as a square.
Yeah.
It's finished
and
now.
It's
Somebody stand here.
Complex.
And could this be part of Hobby Noble's farmstead?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this would fit in quite easily to the 17th century, no problem.
What you got there, Ivan?
It's a cornerstone of the house. And Duncan will be on another one. Tam on another.
Stand out of the way.
Barbara can't resist the opportunity to do a little dowsing.
4, 5, 6 at my paces, and then you've got nothing.
I'm glad Mick Aston isn't here,
And then you've
because I
got
tell you, he
1,
would have nothing
2,
to do with
3,
this whatsoever.
4, 5, 6.
So, Barbara, are you happy that we've got what might be Hobby Noble's farmstead, that we've got his well, that we've got his field, that we've got the track between his well and his farmstead?
Yes, yes.
Well, that's not bad for less than a day's work, is it?
But I think it's very good.
Should we go back to the history room and crow about it?
Why not?
Why not?
Come on, then. Stop dowsing now. The ballad says Hobby died a hero's death at Carlisle, but all the other evidence suggests his life probably ended rather less dramatically at Parkhead Farm in 1620. Join us in part 3 when we follow in the footsteps of the chronicler of the Border Ballads, a man descended from some of the most famous reivers of all, Sir Walter Scott. "20 miles north of Bewcastle is the Scottish town of Langham. I'm here to meet our third team of ballad hunters on a rather special annual occasion."
It's Langham Common riding today.
Of course it is. What is it?
Well, it's basically the riding of the marches. We go round what was given to the townspeople as a common land, and we go out and check the boundaries and make sure nobody has encroached upon these boundaries.
Now, is this genuine reaver activity, or is it a bit of Victorian whimsy for the tourists?
No. Certainly not for the tourists.
Robert Fraser's wife claims to be related to Sir Walter Scott and to a character in a ballad called Mucklemouth Meg. Sir Walter had numerous ancestors who were immortalised in the ballads. The challenge for the team is to work out how much of each tale is historical fact and how much is romantic fiction.
Up the door, laddest, the lion of Liddesdale. Up the door, laddest, Powder comes on. The Armstrongs are flying, their widows are crying. Castleton is burning and Oliver's gone.
This is Abbotsford, near Melrose, built by Sir Walter Scott in 1822. The team has come here to try and uncover the true story of Mucklemouth Meg. As well as being a writer, Scott was also the local sheriff, in stark contrast to his cattle-rustling ancestors. In a ballad based on Scott's story of Mucklemouth Meg, one of his ancestors, Will Scott of Harden, is caught red-handed during a cattle raid on a neighbour.
And the lady is being brought before Sir Gideon for judgment. And Sir Gideon said he's got to be hanged. And Lady Murray is saying to her husband, very good looking, it's rather a pity to hang him. Why don't we offer him his life if he'll marry Meg, who was the plainest of their daughters and whose mouth stretched from ear to ear, so she was called Mucklemouth Meg, or the young Scot. Had a look at her and thought, oh dear, no, I think I'd really be better dead. However, after a few days in the dungeon with no food or water, except what Meg could pass through the bars, he changed his mind and married her. And they were very happy, and it was a, you know, very happy union.
And Sir Walter Scott is descended from Will and Meg.
He is, he is.
My wife claims to be related to Mucklemouth Meg.
And she hasn't got an enormous mouth,
No,
I'm
no,
sure. No.
Wedding photographs don't show a big wide mouth anyway.
Good, I
from
am
ear to
so
ear.
glad.
And do you have a family tree on the premises we can have a look at?
Sadly, we haven't. But I tell you where there is a very good one, and it includes everybody from this family here, is at Harden, the Scots of Harden.
A few miles from Abbotsford is Harden, the home of Walter Scott's ancestor, Old Wat, whose son married Mucklemouth Meg. In an annex to the house, the team find what they're looking for.
And this is the family tree which Sir Walter Scott drew up in his own hand, in his handwriting, and which he started back in the early 1100s and brought up to his own day. Here is Sir Walter. And on the way, we have Old Wat of Harden and William, his eldest son, who married Mucklemouth Meg.
So here we have good evidence of Willie and Meg being married.
And we have, of course, the painting of Meg.
Yes, it's not as grotesque as the ballad would describe.
No, by no
certainly
means.
gets a bad press from them.
And then here we have the marriage contract.
This is with
which bears the
The
date
story goes
1611.
that young Will Scott of Harden was forced to marry Mucklemouth Meg or face the gallows. But it's hard to believe that such a lengthy marriage agreement would have been drawn up for a shotgun wedding.
very interesting signatures.
We
This
have
is,
William Scott,
this is
Agnes Murray, Mucklemouth Meg.
But here we have conclusive proof that the couple in the ballad existed.
Oh, yeah.
The ballad may not be how
right.
the
Oh, that's-
events happened, but the people
Are certainly
are
true.
certainly
That's
true.
Oh, that's
And we have a date now, 1611.
An even more extraordinary character than Mucklemouth Meg is Will Scott's father, Old Wat of Harden. He took part in the most famous reaving raid of all, described in the Ballad of Kinmont Willie.
How they had seen Balkinmont Willie on Harrowby for to hang him up.
The team are with historian Kay McAlpine at the Archive Office in Carlisle.
Kinmont Willie was an Armstrong, and he was a rank reaver of his time, and he was captured by Lord Scroop, the English warden, upon a truce day, a day when they should have been completely immune from any punitive action. And he was taken here to Carlisle and locked up securely, and he was to be executed. However, Buccleuch, who was warden on the Scottish side and a friend of Kinmont Willie's, decided he would get a band of men together and go and rescue him, and they did, using, well, we don't know how many men, but the ballad says 40, and they came to the castle and got through the postern door, released Kinmont Willie and carried him back to Scotland.
What about the Scrope version? What's the thrust of that one?
He says that Wat of Harden led 500 men.
Well, you would, wouldn't you?
Early form of spin doctor.
They're beginning to uncover evidence that the plot to free Kinmont involved a pact between his Scottish friends and the English enemies of Lord Scroop, the warden of Carlisle Castle.
The English were involved in this. If this come to pass, it will make an end of my Lord Scroop and divide Mr. Salkeld and him.
So their object was to part Salkeld and Scroop.
Oh, yeah.
That was the English motive.
It was a conspiracy then between Buccleuch and some of his English friends as well as Scots.
Yes.
And it was possibly an inside job, and that they not so much broke in, but were allowed in.
Then on we held from Carlisle town and Stainshop Bank.
There's no record of where Kinmont was held inside Carlisle Castle, but the details of his escape one night in March 1596 are well recorded, and the gate through which he broke out is still there.
But I've got the key.
That soppy little key for that door.
It's going to open this lock. And here we are. This is the way that Scroop says that they got in to rescue Kinmont Willie.
Well, they're certainly going to have a heck of a job battering that door down, weren't they?
It's a pretty solid door, and it's also set into up in the lintel stone of the roof, so they couldn't actually go over it.
Or lever the door up.
So what's our conclusion?
Somebody either opened the door or left the bolts off the door.
So it was an inside job?
We reckon so. We reckon so.
But what about Willie himself? Do we know anything about him? Did he get married? Did he die with his boots on?
He lived in his tower beside the River Sark, just over the border in Scotland on the edge of the debatable land. And as far as I know, he died there, a reasonably old man.
The events in the Ballad of Kinmont Willie are broadly true, but Sir Walter Scott wasn't above embroidering the details to glorify his ancestors and to tell a better tale.
He's eyeing himself a double free hell, or else his mother a witch would be. I wouldn't have dreaded that one what's up, I'd rather go than Christian be.
So much of the ballad stories are romantic hype, it's easy to dismiss them as fantasy. But you have to remember that they were written to entertain rather than to inform. And even if the stories were heavily embroidered, the characters are real. Have you enjoyed yourselves?
Yes.
You've done brilliantly. 2 days ago, we had 3 border ballads, and now we've got 3 pieces of history. But there's one story that I've kept till last. On a certain day in 1599, a Scottish team from Liddesdale played an English team from Bewcastle at football, during the course of which a certain John Whitfield was disembowelled. In other words, as far as we know, it's the very first England-Scotland international. Now, history doesn't tell us what the score was that day, but hopefully we can come up with one for you now. Thanks for all your hard work.
The next programme in the series is on January the 9th, and you can follow the quests of this week's Time Team History Hunters in a special